Today I'm kind of in an unusual capacity. Many of you may be familiar with the work of Dr. Rosalie Mcilvaney. And she, several years ago, approached St. Louise's unit, which is where my primary base is, as one of the child sexual abuse assessment and treatment services. But she approached us when she was just starting her PhD work for how children disclose. And at the time, she kind of got enough children, so she didn't need us. And then she finished, and she came back to us then a couple of years ago, and I'm now a named researcher along with Rosaleen. But I totally respect, this is Rosaleen's research, okay? So I feel like I'm a wingman today. Rosaleen, unfortunately, because of the work and the timing, we've just finished the first round of data analysis. She's very popular, so I think she's on her 4th conference in like 3 weeks. So she's elsewhere today at another international conference. So Rosaleen is with us by video. And at the end of the video, I'm happy to kind of speak maybe more about the clinical implications of it and kind of integrating what we are learning from the research on how children disclose. So you'll hear Rosaleen speak about kind of the early retrospective pieces that she has done building towards this quite significant piece of research that will yet be further extended because we've just approved an international for multi-site piece of research that'll be done replicating this but extending it out, but also comparing Irish kids with Canadian kids. So it just keeps growing. So do we know how to hit play?
Hello, hi. My name is Rosalie Mcilvaney and I'm based in Dublin City University. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you today. It sounds like a really exciting conference, and I think the idea of bringing people together from different disciplines and different contexts who are really passionate about this issue is a fantastic idea, and I commend the organisers of the conference for that. And as I said, really sorry not to be with you. But I am delighted to have the opportunity to be able to share with you some of the research that we've been doing. So what I'm going to talk today about is a small research study that I've been involved in with my colleagues, Dr. Rhonda Turner from Our Lady's Hospital in Crumlin, and I know that she's here today with you, and she'll be able to draw on her vast experience of working with children who have been abused. So I did this project with Rhonda and also with a research assistant, Aisling Costello. And we did it with the assistance of BAPSCAN. So BAPSCAN is the British Association for the Study of the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. And we were able to get a grant from BAPSCAN to fund employing a research assistant to help us out with this project. So first of all, I'm going to give you a little bit of background information in terms of different research that has been done on the area of child sexual abuse disclosure. So as you can see from the title, our focus in this study was on what helps children tell. A lot of the research in this area has focused more on the barriers to telling and why it is so difficult for children to tell. And I'm going to share some of that information with you, but then move on to try and focus a little bit on, well, how about what actually helps children tell? Maybe we should be focusing more on how to, on using information from children who have told about what helped them tell. So in a way, if you look at all the research that's been done in this area, you could think of it in terms of, the large scale studies which have been kind of representative samples from different countries. And in those surveys, there have been questions about disclosure. So the focus of the study wasn't necessarily on disclosure, but they did have some relevant questions. And we did get some good information from different countries, Ireland, Canada, and the US. And there is also a smaller number of large-scale studies specifically focusing on adolescents. Obviously, as you can imagine, it's difficult to do these kind of studies with children and young people. And we also have some information from research on forensic interviews. So particularly in the US, UK and in Israel, research that has examined how children disclose in the context of forensic interviews. So what it is that helps children give credible accounts of abuse when they have experienced abuse. And we have some information from those kind of studies. So what we've learned from these is that most children don't disclose without a significant delay. Many wait until adulthood, and some never tell. And how we know that some, or how we can speculate that some never tell, is that in a lot of these large-scale studies, we have significant percentages, around 25 to 28%, of people who say they've been abused in the context of a survey, but they've never told anybody before that survey. People might be familiar with the SAVI study in Ireland. In that study, 47% of the people who said during the telephone interview that they had experienced an unwanted sexual experience under the age of 17. 47% of them had never told anyone before that survey. So that's where that idea is coming from, is that actually it's likely that some people never tell. Some children deny when they're asked in the context of forensic interviews, and we know this because we have corroborative evidence that they have been abused. But when they're asked in the context of a formal interview, they deny that this has happened. And that evidence might be in the form of videotaped evidence of the abuse actually happening, or it may be in the form of the offenders confessing that they have abused the child, or perhaps somebody else has observed it. We also know that children and adults experience significant difficulty in confiding, and that this difficulty persists throughout the lifespan. So even when children do tell, they still experience difficulties telling someone else at a later time, or we have stories from adults who have told in childhood but didn't tell anyone else for a number of years and still experience difficulty telling someone as adults. In terms of qualitative studies, we have a lot more interest in the last 15 years in actually trying to interview people who have experienced abuse and getting more in-depth accounts of their experience of disclosure. And again, we have these from different countries. I'm not going to go into detail about these here. I just wanted to have them available on the slides, so those of you who are interested in looking into these studies further, you'll have the references there, that you'll be able to look them up. But in terms of looking at what stops children telling and what has been identified, Roland Summit, way back in 1983, and he was working with a group of mothers who had come together in the form of a self-help group, and their children were beginning to tell them stories about their experiences of abuse. And Summit highlighted the whole issue of secrecy and how children actually keep the secret as a way of managing with the psychological impact of the abuse, that it's really inherent in the experience of abuse to keep it secret. And of course, it's not all children that keep it secret, but most children do. Some of the factors that have been identified as influencing disclosure are age. A lot of studies indicate that older children are more likely to tell. Some studies actually suggest that younger children are more likely to tell, and that has been put down to issues like, you know, that they don't actually understand what's happening, that they might be more likely to spontaneously say something and not understand the consequences. Because, as you'll see further down, some of the reasons why children have difficulty telling is because they understand the consequences of telling. They know that things are going to get worse. They know that, you know, big things are going to happen as a result of what they say. Gender, most studies will show that boys take longer to tell than girls. Most studies show that a child who's abused by someone within the family will delay longer and is less likely to tell than someone who's abused by someone outside the family. And also studies show that children who feel responsibility for the abuse, so children who blame themselves in some way for what happened, also take longer to tell. And those are some references there to support those. More recent studies that have focused more on interviews with children have highlighted issues such as expectation that parents will not be supportive. So young people not telling because they expect a negative outcome or a negative response from their parents. Another issue that's come to light and has been studied a lot more is shame. That children feel ashamed of what happened, and this constitutes a big barrier, and not just for children but adolescents, young adults, older adults, that this is something that persists across the lifespan and really gets in the way of people being able to confide these experiences. And another issue that I certainly was quite struck by in my study, my PhD study, where I interviewed young people about their experiences of disclosure, is that when young people were in families where they did have very supportive parents, they had good relationships with their parents, they didn't want to tell their parents because they were afraid their parents would be upset. And they knew that it would really distress their parents to find out that this had happened. So they were actually protecting their parents by not telling them. So as I mentioned earlier then, to move the focus to what helps children tell, if we rely on those earlier studies that focused on the barriers to telling, then you can turn that on its head and think of, well, children obviously who are abused by someone outside the family will find it easier to tell. Sometimes older age, but as I mentioned earlier, it can be the age issue is a little bit unclear in terms of, you know, consistent patterns. Children who are within a stable family, because children who come from families where there are other difficulties, like for instance domestic violence, alcohol abuse, other kind of difficulties that the family are coping with, there's suggestion that those children will take longer to disclose. However, as I mentioned from my research, actually children in very supportive families, that can in itself be a barrier. But for the most part, the research seems to suggest that if children are within a stable family, they will tell earlier. And also children who experience a once-off abuse are more likely to tell than when the abuse is ongoing over a period of time. And a few other issues that have been highlighted are peer influence, so particularly for teenagers, that the influence of their peers in terms of encouraging them to tell or noticing that something is wrong, asking them questions, what's wrong, you know, why do you not want to do that? And maybe, you know, even sometimes guessing, is there something going on, or is there something about such and such a person that you don't like? That has come to light much more through these qualitative interviews as a factor helping children tell. Being asked and young people being provided with the opportunity to tell is coming through as a very significant factor in terms of helping young people tell. Having a trusting relationship, having someone that people trust and can tell is very important. And a more recent study looked at living with the offender. And of course, that can work two ways. On the one hand, young people talk about not being able to keep the secret any longer because of living with the offender, and over time finding that more and more difficult, and then finally spilling the beans, as it were. And then other people, young people, talk about when the offender has moved out and when they're not living with them, that gives them the space to be able to tell and confide. In my PhD study, one of the conceptual model that I developed from my research was, I entitled it Containing the Secret. And within that, I identified three dynamics as influencing disclosure. First of all, active withholding, so young people keeping the secret to themselves. And then this idea of a pressure cooker effect, so pressure building up over time, sometimes in the form of within, so psychological distress, or sometimes coming from outside, where people would maybe ask them questions, what's wrong, what's going on, or they feel under pressure because of external situations to themselves, and that this would prompt them to tell. And then the third dynamic was one of confiding, where, you know, when they did tell, as mentioned on the previous slide, it was in the context of a trusting relationship. It was very much confiding the secret. In more recent research, people have been trying to take a more developmental systemic lens in acknowledgement of the fact that this is a developmental process. It does span the lifespan, as it were, but also it's influenced by factors at different levels in the kind of ecological context. So at an intrapersonal level, just the examples are shame or blaming themselves, fears for self or feeling distressed, or at an interpersonal level it would be more of fears or concerns for others, being asked by other people, being believed. And then it's important to take account of at a broader systemic level. So at a community level, for instance, school, influence of school and teachers, and co-curricular activities involved in sports, and children's access to other adults that they may be able to confide in. And also at a culture level in terms of society and how any kind of society deals with the issue of child protection. So for instance, in the form of child protection policy or legislation, that all of those factors impact on children's ability to tell. Looking at methodologies that have been used in previous studies, what we wanted to do in our study was, and this is a follow-up from my PhD study, I wanted to actually access children's files in different services. So I knew that during the course of these child sexual abuse evaluations that you're all familiar with, a lot of information is gathered about the disclosure experience. So rather than going and interviewing children, I wondered whether there would be sufficient information on children's files that we could actually collate and see if that would help us make sense of children's experiences. And looking at the research that had been done, for instance in South Africa, colleagues looked at hospital files. In the US, Goodman Brown and colleagues looked at Attorney General's files. Also in the US, Schaefer and colleagues looked at videotapes of children's interviews and extracted information about what they said about their disclosure experience. And what myself and my colleague Maeve Culhan did was we ran a pilot study, first of all, looking at a number of children's files, and we published that in the form of an article with Child Abuse Review. So it was a retrospective analysis of children's assessment reports. So we just looked at their assessment reports to see what kind of information could we gather that spoke to the issue of disclosure. And what we found was that there were three typical themes identified. Feeling distressed, so very high level of distress evident among these children. an opportunity to tell. So that includes the issue I mentioned about being asked. So children actually were provided an opportunity to tell, and that provided the context for them being able to disclose. And a very high number of children who were afraid for themselves if they disclosed. And then less variant themes were less prevalent, so under 50% as in this study. Concerns for others, being believed, shame or guilt, and peer influence. So what we did in that study was we compared the information that we got from children's reports with information that we got from interviews with those same children, because these were the same children that I had interviewed as part of my PhD study. And what we found, I'm not going to go into detail about this slide, it was just, you can look at it later, you have a copy of the slides there. But what was interesting was that, you know, it wasn't necessarily a strong match between the information in the files and the information in interviews, but some information was in the files that didn't come through in the interviews, and some came through in the interviews that didn't come through in the files. So on the basis of this, we felt it was a valid enough way to gather data, and particularly if you've got a larger number of children, and to try and investigate a little bit more. So the present study that I'm going to give you some findings from was conducted with the Child Sexual Abuse Assessment Unit in the Children's Hospital. There were 80 children's files examined. The children had been seen for assessment by 2 professionals who had given an opinion that the child had given a credible account of sexual abuse. And permission was granted, so we had written consent from parents to use file information for research purposes. And we obtained ethical approval from Children's Hospital and Dublin City University. And as I mentioned earlier, we got the grant from BAPSCAN. So we had a data record sheet that was developed as part of the pilot study, and we gathered information like the age of the child, the time that they were abused, who the alleged perpetrator was, and any details we could find about the actual disclosure. And the variables that we looked at, this was really a content analysis, the variables we looked at were variables that had already been identified in the qualitative research studies. We had 2 people independently code the data record sheets, and I randomly selected some of those, as well as meeting with the coders to make sure that there was a consistent approach to coding. I randomly selected them to make sure that to oversee the integrity. And we imported this initially into an Excel spreadsheet and coded, and then into SPSS to do some statistical analysis. So this is just a description of our sample. You can see there in terms of the spread of male, female, intrafamilial, extrafamilial abuse. Interestingly enough, quite a significant proportion of these children came from families where there was a parental history of childhood sexual abuse, or sexual assault in adulthood, or domestic abuse within the family, and a sibling history of sexual abuse. So I thought that really struck me when I saw that, because even though obviously clinically we come across this, I wouldn't have seen percentages of it before. In terms of age at onset, most of the children were in that middle childhood years, 5 to 12. Abuse experience, quite a high level of penetrative abuse, which again wouldn't necessarily fit with my clinical experience. And you know, I'm not sure what that's about in terms of whether that's representative of other services as well. The age of alleged perpetrator, quite a significant percentage were under 20, so some teenagers and young adults, and vast majority were abused by a male figure. So the first aim in this research was to test the conceptual model that I had developed in my PhD in terms of containing the secret. So the active withholding were themes like confining the secret, difficulty saying it, feeling shame, fears for self, concerns for other, as in not wanting to upset other people, or being told not to tell. And you can see, I've just put the percentages there, though those themes rated very highly in this sample of 80 children. In terms of the pressure cooker effect, feeling distressed, contact with alleged perpetrator, confining the secret, tried to tell or tried to stop the abuse, and peer influence, I've highlighted the ones that were high percentages. And then finally, in terms of confiding, support of teacher or counsellor, sharing confidences, and that was usually in the context of peers. And also you can see in terms of who children told, it was either a parent, primarily a parent, or a peer for these young people. So the hypothesis that we had going into this study was, well, what helps children tell? Is there a relationship between all these variables that we have and the time to disclosure? So can we identify which factors are more helpful for children than others in terms of time to disclosure. And we also wanted to look at the relationships between, for instance, being believed, being asked, etc. And we did our statistical analysis, etc., and we came up with no significant differences between groups, as in if we looked at children who disclosed within a month or after a month, there was no significant differences. No significant differences in gender in terms of boys and girls, which is unusual because a lot of studies find those differences. So I think the fact that we didn't find differences is interesting in itself. This is just to give you a flavour of the time to disclosure, because most studies will look at this and see, comparing children who told within the first 24 hours, for instance, compared to after 24 hours. So most children did not tell within 24 hours. Even if we look at a month, 60% took longer than a month to tell. So our conclusions were that really qualitative studies have highlighted how complex this is and how difficult it is actually to identify patterns, and that perhaps there aren't patterns. Maybe it's so complicated and it's such a unique experience, unique to each individual, that we can't really identify predictive patterns. What it has highlighted is that it's just really important to understand individual child experiences. We can go back and look at the qualitative data we have, and we plan to do that in terms of getting more richness from the data. But this is kind of this preliminary stage. These are the findings that we have, and we also, this is part of a larger study in terms of other services that we can feed into. So I just wanted to share some resources with you for those of you who are interested in more, I suppose, concrete advice in terms of helping children tell. There's a number of articles here for parents, for teachers. I've written a book, Finding the Words. It's to help parents have conversations with their children about difficult topics. And I also have a book coming out shortly for professionals on helping children talk about sexual abuse. So thank you very much for your attention, and as I said at the beginning, I'm really sorry that I can't be with you, but please feel free to email me if anybody wants any of those resources that I've mentioned. Thank you.
I was reflecting on it because Rosalie and I both started off directly doing assessment work around credibility cases, and I was kind of listening to this journey so many years later and just looking at the confirmed cases, those where we believe these children had been abused, and looking at the disclosure process and what can we learn from that. And I was kind of thinking of so many different things. It truly is such an individual experience. Just in this 1 week, I've had a former child who's now an adult make contact with me by phone wanting to access her records. And I'm facilitating that. But what's her story, she remembers very, very clearly. I remember meeting with a nice lady, and I knew she wanted me to tell her what my brother had done, but there was no way I was going to tell her. I only told my husband last week, and that's why I'm ringing you. So I know that when I'm with my team, there's a sense of we're nice people, and I can establish rapport, and I can play with the doll's house with the 3-year-old, and I'm so nice and lovely. Of course this child is going to tell me. We have to get off of our little soapbox and remember there is somebody else in the room who's making a choice to tell or not to tell. The other, again, just in the last week, I had a mother ring me whose daughter is now 16 and she's currently an inpatient for anorexia. At the time they were first referred, the child was unaccessible. She could not separate. And it was probably a very likely scenario that had occurred. Mom had a boyfriend, child a couple of days after some unsupervised time with mom's boyfriend made a few comments that were concerning, and mom reacted appropriately, protected the child. Mom was actually kind of in the biz, all right, won't go any more than that, and she really wanted her daughter to be okay, and her daughter never brought it up again. And the mom kind of thought, well, she's only 6. If she's not bringing it up, I don't want to bring it up. She's going to forget about it. We're just going to kind of trot along with life, and I'll match what she's bringing to me. The daughter now is recovering memories in dreams and feels that she's kind of going crazy and feels that mom's response was not loud enough and clear enough and containing enough because mom never responded to the disclosure to the child. The mom, while she did all the right things, she took her to social workers, brought her into CS. The mom never actually went back to the child and said, do you know, that's important what you told me. That's not okay. You did nothing wrong. I'm so glad you told me. But there wasn't any containment of it by the mom. And now the worry from the psychiatric team is that's a part of how we got here. So we have kids who want to tell us, we have kids who can't tell us, and we have kids who are going to choose not to tell us. And we also have kids where nothing has happened. And I'm mindful that, especially I think when we're in the helping professions, there's such a strong desire to want to believe children. Again, I've just finished a case with a, I think, because I think I might have done my very, very last ever custody and access assessment. I'm very excited about this possibility. But in under 5, and there's no information to support sexual abuse. But the child did say something, and the child did exhibit sexualized behaviors at the time of making these comments to mom. But the mother herself is very emotionally uncontained. The mother is very unboundaried and had allowed the child to spontaneously start breastfeeding again after 2.5, 3 years of not breastfeeding. So you can kind of get the flavor that there's a few other things going on. But yet if we assume and we jump in, we can contribute to the problem. So it's about knowing, how do children who've been abused tell? And some of the pieces that are in this research that are coming out about how important it is to have that opportunity to ask the question, to give kids the opportunity to tell. When they do tell, and you ask them, well, how come you decided to tell me today? Do you know, I really feel kind of privileged that you chose to tell me. And they'll kind of say, I knew you could handle it. You know, so it's a complex system, and all this is very important. So those are some of the main points I just thought I'd kind of bring into to top off the research. How am I doing on time? Am I done? I don't know if there's any questions on Rosaleen's research before I pass over to. I will pass over. Nope, almost.
Can I just ask you a question, not directly related to the research, but can I just ask you your experience on assessing retractions?
Very challenging. It depends on a number of factors. Certainly the research exists that retraction should be considered part of the disclosure process, and that if there is a retraction and the price of the disclosure has been very high, that it probably is a false retraction. However, I know again, just in the last 2 weeks, we did establish that the retraction was the true event. And the child was well able to kind of explain to us the journey that they'd been on. I think more often than not, I get very suspicious about the retraction, and I think depending on the age of the child and the context of the child's living environment and possible contaminants or external pressures, all have to be considered. It's not surprising that there's retraction, but I think we just have to get very, very careful analysis and look at all the possible things that might be influencing it, and then make it okay for the child to say whatever they need to say. Because certainly if they feel boxed in, then they can get very rigid in their account, whereas if we make it okay for them to just help us understand why that got said and how come this got said, and help us understand where you're at now, then we can understand it as long as we're open with them in exploring any possibility. But our bias has to be controlled, because our bias and belief systems absolutely will affect the quality of information that's shared by a child regardless of age, but particularly with the younger ones. All right? Yeah. Thank you.